Welcome to A Night for Truth, the life and work of Dietrich von Hildebrand, a series we are doing with Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, the wife of Dietrich von Hildebrand. I'm Tom Howard. Dietrich von Hildebrand's young life and the development of his thinking, his reading, his background. He is best known now by the people who were not fortunate enough to have known him personally, which would include myself, as a writer. When did he start writing, Lily?
He wrote his first article in 1921.
When he was about...
He was, at this time, he was 31 years of age.
Yeah, 31.
As I told you, for 7 years, he saturated himself with Catholic thought and Catholic teaching until truly he knew his religion inside out. And then in 1921 he dared for the first time write as a Catholic. Before he said to me, I felt that I was not yet worthy of talking as a Catholic because I was still a student, I was learning. But in 21 he wrote his first article, which I love, unfortunately untranslated into English, and it's called The New World of Christianity, totally dedicated to the reality of the supernatural, the transfer. You know, it's still, let us say, on a more simple basis, but it simply wants to show that the very essence of Catholicism is a full acceptance of God's revelation as being infinitely above anything that a human being could have conceived. You know, you can truly say Roman Catholicism, if I'm used, my husband, could never enter a man's head. It cannot be a human invention. It is something that transcends the possibility of any sort of human invention. We can invent fairies, we can invent witches, we can invent giants, we can invent lots of things. But I mean that God becomes man out of love to save us and accept the humiliation of being a man with all his limits and weaknesses and accepts to suffer and die on the cross. This is something that, you know, it never entered a man's head. And so that was his first article. Now there's something that I must say, and I will repeat several times. My husband had a particular genius for taking every single step to ruin his career. And he succeeded beautifully, because in some way you can say his career was a flop from beginning to end. Maybe at the end, I mean, a relative flop. At Fordham it got a little bit better, at least officially.
I think the judgment...
It's not financially, but officially.
I think the judgment of history and of eternity will not use the word flop.
Well, simply say objectively, no.
Yes.
There is this young professor attracting a large number of students because, of course, you know, he's so friendly and so nice and you know, and tells jokes and so on and so on, and he hasn't got the dignity that a professor in a human university should possess, number one. And then number two, he publishes an article, The New World of Christianity. That's not serious scientific. No footnotes. Not a single footnote in the whole article. I mean, this is definitely not scholarship. You know, you cannot take that sort of a person seriously. I mean, he doesn't deserve to be called professor and to ascend in the hierarchy of the university. Then you have to write books that are as boring as possible, as many footnotes as possible. And my husband said, why should I devote myself to things that I find boring instead of talking about these magnificent topics that are illuminating my life? It went from bad to worse, because soon afterwards he was giving a talk. He started giving very, very many talks. He was invited by lots of Catholic organizations, you know, this young professor who was so dynamic and so ardent and so fervent and so on and so on. And he had to give a talk on marriage. And who was in Munich at the time but Nuntius Pacelli? And my husband said
known to the rest of the world nowadays as
Pope, the great Pope Pius XII. And it is my most ardent wish that this great man be canonized, in spite of all the smut which is being thrown at his face. Well, I mean, of course, he's on the other side and it doesn't mind, but we have to fight and to defend him. And for my husband, a young convert, to meet someone, a prince of the church, whose dignity, way of behaving, way of talking, way of celebrating Mass was so impregnated by Catholicism. You know, for example, the way that a person walks, the way that a person sits, the way that a person talks, you know whether or not he's conscious of the fact that God is present in his soul. I sometimes wonder if people saw the way that they laugh, the way that they eat, the way that they sit, the way that they talk, the way that they behave. In this very moment you say to yourself, do they know that they are God's child? Do they know that through baptism the Holy Trinity is living in their soul? And you see, this is something that impressed my husband enormously. That was the first time that he met a prince of the church. He was to meet very many of them. And he tells me, and I experienced this myself because I saw him several times, when he stepped into the room, you knew that he was a man who lived his Catholic life. He had a noble, humble dignity about him as God's servant, and simultaneously he lived up to the dignity of his calling. You see, when you have prince of the church, there is the man and there is the prince of the church. And of course there should be unity between the two. And you know, in many cases this unity doesn't exist. But I mean, in his case, my husband said, you felt somehow that he was conscious of this dignity. He lived up to it, and simultaneously he accepted it in a very humble fashion. There was nothing pretentious or arrogant. You know, I've seen some of them, some say, you know, I'm Cardinal so and so, and you know, you sort of feel that they feel very highly of themselves. Not so in Pius XII. And
which I think is a theme that comes out in your husband's work too, is one of the components of our authentic dignity is humility. And your husband's capacity to recognize that in Pacelli.
Humility makes us great. You know, that is a paradox. That is a paradox of Christianity. The lower you go, the more you recognize yourself to be nothing, the more God is going to elevate you through his grace.
I don't think Napoleon knew that.
Well, this was Napoleon. You know, it seems to me that we've done a lot better since, you know, in the negative sense. At any rate, you know, my husband invited him to his beautiful house in Munich. One of his brother-in-law was a sculptor who immediately is going to make a sculpture, and it exists today, of Pacelli. The other one was a famous musician, the one who married Berthelot, who was so extraordinarily musical. And every time that he would come for a session, you know, my husband was present, of course, and then he would say, oh, why don't you play the piano for me? And so Walter Braunfels, the pianist and the composer, you know, was become famous at that time because of the composition of his great work, The Birds, which was premiered in Munich in 1921, directed by Bruno Walter, who writes in his memoirs that was the greatest work that I introduced to the public in Munich. And now, to my joy, I found out 2 years ago that it is available in the United States and is on the bestseller list of operas, because The Birds of Aristophanes that he has put in music. At any rate, there was the brother-in-law playing the piano, there was his brother-in-law sculpting him, and there was my husband enjoying the whole show. And then every single time he said, Your Eminence, what should we play? And he said, the Liebestod of Tristan and Isolde. That was a piece that he loved so very particularly. And my husband said you could see on his face that he was enjoying the music so enormously. And so my husband invited him to take walks. His house was situated on the other side of the Isar, you know, the river dividing Munich, and there were beautiful trees going all the way down to the river. And they would take long walks, and my husband said, Your Eminence, I have to give a talk on marriage. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about it, and it seems to me, not in Catholic teaching, but the way that it is taught to simple people, there is such an emphasis on procreation that the unitive dimension of marriage, that is to say the love between husband and wife, has been a little bit too much in the shade. And I'm planning in this talk of mine, you know, to emphasize that marriage should be based on a reciprocal love of husband and wife, and precisely this love is symbolized and it blossoms in procreation. The two things cannot be severed, they belong essentially together, but it seems to me that more light should be said or shed on the first aspect. And he said, but you're right, as Italians do, they always spoke Italian together. You're right, of course put it down. And so he wrote his first lecture, Marriage, in which he made a distinction between the unitive part and the procreative part, insisting upon the deep linking system between the two.
We should mention in this connection here that, of course, this very theme of the unity of the unitive and the procreative is a major emphasis of the Holy Father now,
well, of course,
John Paul II.
This is why soon after he became Pope, I knew through friends that he had my husband's box. And then, I would never have dared to do so, but after Vatican II, women became very prominent, and I said to myself, even though I'm only a woman, I'm just going to apply and try to have a private audience. I got it just like that. And the Pope immediately told me his admiration for my husband and so on and so on. And so I had a long private talk for 20 minutes. That is one of the great experiences of my life, of course. And then he said, I had mentioned the changes in the liturgy and certain changes that were definitely not commanded by Vatican II, and on top of it, the total abolition of the Tridentine Mass. And I said, my husband raised a very serious question, is it ever legitimate to prohibit, and I insist upon the word prohibit, a sacred tradition that goes back for centuries and centuries and centuries? And what is so amazing about the Holy Father is how receptive he is. He listens. He listens so intently that you have the feeling the whole world disappears. He's just interested in what you're going to say. And he was silent for a moment, and he says, no doubt your husband is one of the very great ethical thinkers of this century. Meaning to say, I'm going to think about it. And 2 years later, he wrote the Indult. So, just to show you, he's very, very, very much influenced by my husband's thought. His book, and I sent him the last book after my husband's death, on the Moralia, and received a very nice note from his secretary thanking me.
Well, I think also the Holy Father's Wednesday talks from about 1980, that it's in a little volume called The Original Unity of Man and Woman.
Yes.
It's very, very, very close to a great many things that your husband
But what is interesting?
What
is interesting is that some people who are very narrow-minded and believe that they are great Catholics started to persecute him, because they simply see he's opening the door to all sorts of abuses and so on, and love is just a word, and this is just an imagination, and people cannot base a marriage on love, and the rest of it. Well, at any rate, I still recall very clearly that once we were visiting a convent in Salamanca in Spain, and when my husband told his life, the superior said, what? You have this terrible man who has introduced the notion that love should be a crucial role in marriage. No, my husband said, I'm basing this on the teaching of the Church, because suppose that a wife and a husband cannot have children, and it's no fault of their own. The marriage is as valid and can glorify God more than a marriage in which there are 12 children and the husband and wife simply live together, but there's no communion of soul. So he simply said that is a teaching of the Church, and of course from now on it plays a tremendous role, and I thank and bless the Holy Father for having highlighted this so magnificently. Now, shortly, so Pius XII says, go ahead, this is absolutely correct, and he encouraged him. So he said to himself, His Eminence agrees with my thesis and will develop it, and then he gave this talk that had a resounding success, and it was published as a little book. And then I told in previous sessions, previous episodes, something which is very crucial. My husband benefited from grace long before he knew that there was something called grace. He lived in a very liberal milieu, and simply means a great open-mindedness toward all sorts of things. From the time he was a teenager, he was so conscious that the sexual sphere is something great that calls for respect, and it never occurred to him to fool around with it until he found someone that he truly loved and wanted to commit himself for life.
Now we have to repeat this. We're talking about a teenager,
a young man, you know,
or a young man,
13 or 14 or something
who
of the sort.
recognized the sexual sphere as something sacred.
Not yet sacred. Great.
That's something great, something noble.
Something noble. Something, because a question of sacredness, this is something to come later.
Yeah.
You know, this is precisely the change which is going to take. No, something great, something noble, something that you cannot fool with.
Of great dignity.
You have it. That is a perfect formulation. He just felt this instinctively. I mean, in other words, a grace when he did not know that grace existed, because you know full well how young people, and then afterwards university students, and then the liberal world in which we live, I mean he lived, you know, all these people, or many of these people, had relationships, even though at that time the appearances were kept.
I was going to say, you know that this is a somewhat unusual point of view.
But you know, he was so convinced of it, absolutely so convinced of it, that he was not going to fool around. And so he was tremendously protected. And, you know, which doesn't mean that, you know, he didn't kiss a girl or something of the sort, but I mean, at any rate, one of the rare cases of young people who have no religion or no religious training, who was leading a pure life. And then, the moment that he entered the church, Tom, absolute revolution. And revolution in this sense, that before he respected natural virtues, justice and honesty and reliability and faithfulness and so on and so on. And you know, as I said, purity in the sense of respecting, understanding that the sexual sphere is something very great and you are not going to fool around with it. That he did do. But all of a sudden, he discovers the supernatural. And a totally new dimension of the sexual sphere opened up for him. And I claim that in his works you're going to find insights of such sublimity that I wish every single person listening to this or viewing this particular show will get acquainted with his thought. Because there's nothing more needed today, more desperately needed today, than understanding of what he's going to call the sacredness of the sexual sphere. In other words, it's not only something great and something beautiful and so on, it is sacred.
Sacred. And this is, of course, totally unknown in the secular sphere, in the high schools and universities, and widely unknown, I'm afraid, among Catholic young people.
Well, I'm afraid that you're right. I wish you were wrong, but I'm afraid...
I wish I were wrong, too.
Yes.
But
no, he wrote this book, Purity and Virginity. And
both words would cause embarrassment if you mentioned them at a cocktail party now. Purity and virginity, ha, ha, ha.
And he wouldn't mind. He would simply wouldn't mind. No, Nuncius Pacelli was then in Berlin. And when he got a copy of the book, he wrote my husband a personal letter to thank him for this magnificent work. Now, I've been trying, of course, when a husband lost everything, he lost this letter too. And I've been writing to the Vatican to try to get a copy, because I know approximatively the year in which it was written, and they told me the archives were still closed. But I mean, I hope before I die that they're going to be open. Maybe they're open today. It was about 5 or 6 years ago that I wrote this letter. And then I can get a copy, because it is to my mind a tremendously precious document.
Well, and maybe with this attack on Pius XII, maybe some of these archives will be open, because a letter like that would certainly testify to the saintliness of Eugenio Pacelli.
You know, at any rate, suppose that now we dedicate all the time we have to what he's going to call the sacredness and the mystery of the sexual sphere. And there, Tom, you'll have to try very hard to stop me, because once I get going on this topic, which is particularly dear to me, it's very difficult to stop me.
That's all right. The stops will just be temporary between episodes.
All right, good. You know, first of all, one of the big fundamental mistakes of Freud, who my husband considered to be a philosophical and social catastrophe, And his one attack on Freud, of course he put it very wittily, he said, there's a man devoting his whole life to talk about sex, and he does not understand it at all. Because his thesis is sex is invented by God to be an expression of love between husband and wife. And if you isolate it, you totally misunderstand it. It is not an instinct like sleeping or eating or drinking or something of the sort. Of course there's a dimension of instinct, but it is an instinct that is so radically different, because whatever is related to the sexual sphere is deep, as opposed to something superficial. Maybe I meet you for the first time, and we start talking about politics, and we express a great admiration for what is taking place in Washington. And
admiration, did you say?
Well, I'm not sure that I was using the right word, but it doesn't matter, let's forget about
astonishment.
it. And, let's say admiration in quotes. Yes. And so say, let's talk about this, let's go to a restaurant. And you and I just met an hour ago, and then, we eat together. This does not imply any sort of very, very close relationship between us. I have meals with lots of people that I hardly know. I see them once, and that's all there is to it. Sex is something always deep. And therefore, it is totally different from eating or sleeping or drinking. It is something which is very, very central in human life. And we're going to shed light on the mystery of the person, the understanding precisely that we are sexual beings. But then my husband said, what is of course radically different between sex and eating or sleeping or whatever it is. Another person is involved. Suppose that I waste water. It can be silly, and it can be pretty bad if you live in southern countries when there's a drought. But in and by itself, it's perfectly. Water does not suffer from being wasted. But if I'm dealing with you, a human being made to God's image and likeness, in this very moment, my first basic attitude should be reverence. I cannot approach you simply as if you were an object.
And we need to, I think it needs to be underlined at this point that you're making some specific points here. That first of all, it is deep. It always goes deep, and people know that. They don't object if their friend has shaken hands with somebody, but they do object if they find out that they've had sex with them. It's deep, and now it involves another person. Your husbands, and I've heard you speak on this many times, that I'm just highlighting here the fact that there are several specific points here that
there are very many.
Demolish the idea that sex is just another natural human.
Well, it's fun. It's fun. It's exciting.
That's quite true.
No, you see, not only when I talk to you, happen to be a special friend of mine, but whoever I meet, my first attitude should be, there is a child of God. There is someone made to God's image and likeness. And immediately, it's going to prevent me from treating them, as if they were non-existent or non-important. This is basically Christian attitude. Before I greet you as a friend, I must greet you as a child of God, whose image of the Holy Trinity is in your soul. Now, obviously, in the case of sex, the proximity, the intimacy that exists between these two people implies an attitude of reverence which is still increased. And let us not forget, and this is an idea that my husband has so beautifully developed in literature and personality, what he calls the virtue of discretion. There's a space separating all human beings. And in order for you and I, to become very close friends, we have to traverse this space step by step. We cannot skip and suddenly say, I met you yesterday, now let's sleep together. This is something which is horrendous, because obviously it is, so to speak, a climax of a long line of ascent, of coming closer and closer and closer. You have this at Holy Mass. First, in the old liturgy, or the so-called old liturgy, the priest started at the foot of the altar, which was so symbolic, meaning to say, I'm not worthy to approach the altar, which symbolizes Christ. And then after having purified himself, he ascended and then prayed other prayers, and then, there is a crescendo, as in music, as in the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, and then comes consecration, which is a now. Now, you see, therefore, in order for a human relationship, in one as intimate, as profound as the sexual relationship between husband and wife, there is a long preparatory, which doesn't mean long in time-wise, but long in the sense that all these steps must be traversed.
And we have reached the bottom, shall we say, of the steps to the altar at this point, but we're coming, it seems to me, to the very much the nub of the richness of your husband's work, and I think his work on love and sexuality is as close to his tremendous vision of the dignity and sacredness of personhood as any other topic he ever wrote on. But our audience is going to have to wait for the next episode. Thank you, Lily.